Welcome to part 2 of 4 for the topic Ecology, Ecologists, and Asking Questions. In this video, we're going to go over the learning objective focused on illustrating how ecological systems exist in hierarchical organization. And so as biology students, you've learned about all the different levels of biology, starting with the smallest molecular level, DNA. That kind of grows into the cellular level. So if we give, for an example here, a nerve cell, nerve cells add together to form tissue, so nervous tissue, which brings us to our next level. And nervous tissue can group together to form an organ, for instance, the brain. And once you're starting to look at organs, you're generally looking at an organ system. So the brain and the spinal cord are part of the nervous system. And so trying to understand how all of those things go together. And so this is a hierarchy, right? Where you have levels above other levels, and those levels build on the level below them. And so we can use this hierarchy to continue to think about where ecology fits in. And so once you have multiple different organ systems, that brings you to a whole organism. And so thinking about individual organisms, which are kind of focused on surviving and reproducing. They're what natural selection is acting on. All of those organisms grouped together form a population. The population can grow, it can shrink, and it's what is evolving over time. Populations of different species that live in the same general area are going to interact with each other, and they form an ecological community. And when you put a bunch of ecological communities close together such that they experience a lot of the same fluxes of energy and matter, then you have an ecosystem. And so all of these levels of the ecological hierarchy can be found in the biosphere. As far as we know, there's only one biosphere, our planet. And depending on what level you're working on, you're going to be asking different questions. And so the idea for this video is to try and understand these different levels in a little bit more detail. Before we move on to that, I want to point out that these first early levels here, molecular, cellular, tissue, and organ, are generally what you're focusing on if you're in a biochemistry class, a cell class, or a molecular biology class. The organ systems and the individuals are generally what you're focusing on if you're in, for instance, a physiology class or a neurobiology class. So these are generally categorized as organismal biology. And then over here, the figure from your textbook is representing the ecological and evolutionary hierarchy that ecologists study. And so these different realms of biology, very frequently you get locked into one. So you, like cells, you become a cell biologist and you kind of focus here and you never ever really consider anything above or really below the level that you're interested in. And I just want to point out that this is not always the case. So for instance, in my research, I'm really interested in population genetics, and so I actually work at two levels. I work at the population ecological level, and I work at the molecular level with DNA. And so you can kind of cross hierarchy here, but for the most part, the different fields of biology cover one section of this biological hierarchy. So let's look at ecological hierarchy in a little bit more detail. So individuals, you're looking at how structure, morphology, so the body plan, the physiology, and the behavior all lead to an individual's survival and reproduction in its environment. People studying individuals are really interested, for the most part, in adaptation. So how are organisms adapted to their environment? Do those adaptations persist, or if an environment changes, will that adaptation go away? The next step up, when you have a group of individuals all together, you're looking at a population. Population ecologists are really interested in what determines the number of individuals and their variation in time and space. So remember last video we were talking about these two things, right? Abundance and distribution of organisms. A bunch of interacting species form a community. And again, kind of the same core questions, right? So what determines the diversity? So now instead of the number of individuals, we care about the number of different species. And the relative abundance, so why one species might be more common than another species living together in the same ecological community. A bunch of ecological communities that are connected through energy and matter transfer are going to be intertwined, and ecosystem ecologists are really interested in how energy and matter move throughout the environment. So for instance, you've probably heard of the carbon cycle or the nitrogen cycle, and trying to understand how nitrogen goes from the atmosphere into our proteins is actually a really complex cycle. And so ecosystem ecologists are interested in this, and they're interested in both the biotic components, so what the organisms are doing to move energy and matter around, but also the abiotic components like ocean currents and things like that are moving energy and matter around. And finally, the biosphere, so our planet encompasses kind of the core air and water availability. It also includes all of the energy, and so trying to understand how air, water, energy, and chemicals that are contained in air and water are circulating globally. So not just within a particular ecosystem, but the reality is all those ecosystems are connected to each other because they all exist on the same planet. And so remember from the previous video, our definitions of ecology. Ecology begins at this organismal level, this individual level, and each level of the hierarchy builds on the one before it. So let's take these different levels and apply them to an actual ecological question. And so here we have Indonesia, and the map is showing you deforestation in Indonesia over the past 60, 70 years. So this map was made in 2010 or shortly after 2010, and they projected into the future 2020 to see kind of if deforestation continued at the pace that it is going at when they made the map, what would deforestation look like? And so you can see that from 1950 to 2020, we had a lot of forest loss, right? So you go from basically having entirely forested island to just some of these patches. Some of the patches are kind of large, but you can see a lot of these patches are really tiny. And so if we're trying to do research on deforestation in Indonesia, we can ask ecological questions at a whole bunch of different levels. So the individual level, we could focus on a particular species like this orangutan here, and we could ask, how does the foraging behavior of orangutans change in a degraded forest? So orangutans like to move a lot, and in order to move a lot, they need to have big pieces of continuous forest. And so you might imagine that if an orangutan gets stranded in one of these little fragments out here, it's not going to have as much space as it needs to find food. And so that's going to be problematic for the orangutan. So individual level questions often focus on adaptations. They focus on behavior, trying to understand how a particular species is dealing with a particular environment. At the population level, we could ask, what are the effects of logging on horned frog reproduction and population growth? So here we don't really care about the responses of any one individual, but we want to know how the deforestation is affecting the whole population of these frogs. So is the population growing? Is it shrinking? Is reproduction affected? Is survival affected? What's actually going on with these frogs, and can we do anything to help them survive the deforestation? Community level, as we kind of move through this timeline here, how does plant species diversity compare in old growth and recently logged habitats? And so old growth would be any of these patches that were never logged. And then these patches out here that are a little more fragmented, maybe they were logged and a few years ago, and now they're regrowing, and trying to understand how many species we see and what their relative abundances are going to be what a community ecologist is interested in. They're interested in these interactions between different species. And I want to point out that we tend to think of these hierarchical scales as getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but a community doesn't have to be large to be a community. And so one of my friends from graduate school actually studied the communities inside pitcher plant water. Okay, so this is like 5 milliliters of water, but it's teeming with bacteria and protozoa and even some mosquito larvae. And so she was really interested in how these different species interacted with each other, what happens if you remove one bacteria and add a different one, same for protozoa, what happens if you have the predatory mosquito larvae, and what happens if you don't. And so these types of questions are still community level questions, even though they're happening at a really, really small scale. And finally, the ecosystem level, so looking at our island of Indonesia again, what are the effects of deforestation on carbon sequestration and cycling? So making sure that carbon is being brought into the trees, right? When you cut down a bunch of trees, you're releasing a whole bunch of carbon into the environment that may or may not be accessible to different organisms. And so trying to understand that carbon cycle and what happens when you remove a tree, which is also pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. When you remove a bunch of trees, how is that going to change the ecosystem and the carbon cycling in that area?